So at this same time last week, events in Kenosha, Wisconsin seemed to just reflect another unnecessary shooting of a black man by police. But by the end of last week, things took a deadly turn. A white 17-year-old male shot three people and killed two of them as armed and unarmed white community members took to the streets to go against the protests and to protect property, as they called it. Now Kenosha is burning, and there are a new wave of protests going around U.S. cities. Unfortunately, the murkiness of protests and the growing presence of armed activists on both sides has made it difficult to distinguish who is good and who is bad. Do we call them vigilantes, counter-protesters, terrorists, or extremists? Today, we're going to cover all of this on the Tonic Accord. What's up, Drew? How are you doing? Alex Kapitko here, and thanks for joining us today.
Hey, man, I'm doing good. I'm ready to get into this stream. It's going to be another tough one. You know, a lot of tough topics these days, especially in the United States. But it's important to talk about. It's important to dive into, and especially, like you said, it can get really murky. And it's good to kind of sift through that murkiness to find some nuggets of truth and to try as best as we can to leave our biases behind.
Yeah. No, exactly. And honestly, this has been really complicated, man, because, you know, I feel like in the past, even in Charlottesville, which was about 3 years ago now, it was kind of easy to distinguish right and wrong, right? You had protesters on both sides, but it was only one man who drove his car through the crowd and killed people. But now, you know, I think it was yesterday, we had a Trump supporter who was killed in Portland. And then at the same time, we've had unarmed and not proven guilty African Americans throughout the country killed by police. And now we have this 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse who shot three people and killed two of them. And I get confused, man, because I've tried to follow both sides and kind of see what people are saying. And it's like if you listen to left-wing media or read left-wing media, then, you know, this kid is a natural-born domestic terrorist and he shouldn't have got a pass from the police. And he kind of backs up this kind of growing vigilantism in the U.S. But then if you look on the right, he was just an innocent kid who was put in an unfortunate situation and was defending property. And because there was no backup, he did what he had to do. And it's so hard to sift through it because there's false narratives on both sides. So what do you think? I mean, what do you, I know it's complicated. What are your first takeaways?
Well, I think he's rightly charged with murder. He's charged with two accounts of aggravated murder, and then he account of attempted murder because of the third person he shot his bicep off. So, you know, and that's the law, right? He's charged with murder. He's a murderer, or at least potentially a murderer. As to what exactly happened, there's a lot we don't know. I think there's leading up to what happened, there's reports that some rioters were doing something with like a garbage bin, pushing it or lighting it on fire. From what I understand, again, the facts are murky, and I'm certainly not on the ground an expert in this. But from what I understand, it was at that point with this like dumpster that Kyle Rittenhouse got involved. There was a scuffle, and then he shot three people and killed two. Kyle feels like he was threatened, right? And I'm sure his side is going to claim it was self-defense. I think that there's a lot of like justification for this action that I don't think is valid. Like, first off, I've seen a lot of people that says, you know, if you didn't want to get shot, don't be out protesting. Or Steven Crowder, a famous, an infamous YouTuber.
I find him funny.
Yeah, he's goofy, but I don't think I agree with a lot of his points. And he posted just 3 days ago that, you know, if you're out rioting and looting, you forfeit your right to live. That's not true. I don't believe that. That's not true at all. That's not based in any law. That's certainly not based in our Constitution. Just because you are committing a crime does not mean you don't have any rights, especially the right to live. So the narrative that, oh, you shouldn't be out looting and rioting if you don't want to get shot, I don't buy that logic. On the other, and I also don't think that Kyle Rittenhouse left his house with the intent to kill people. I think he had a different kind of mindset. I think he had this mindset like he wanted to be a hero. This is not like a school shooter or like a church shooter that just their whole thing is to kill as many people as possible and either kill themselves after or, you know, get arrested or whatever. I think Kyle Rittenhouse believed himself. Like I think he believed in his idea of I'm going to go over there, I'm going to help protect businesses. And I'm going to, you know, get rid of graffiti. I'm going to do what he believed was good things for his community. The problem is he was illegally carrying that firearm. He crossed state lines to do so. It was not his job to protect that area, right? It's not his job. He's not a police officer. It wasn't his store that he was in front of or whatever. He was just in a town 15 minutes from his house across the state border. So I see it as someone who is so wrapped up in a narrative of these radical mobs are, you know, tearing down our country and I'm going to help save it. And in doing so, he made a very bad decision to illegally carry a firearm, get involved with people that are already charged up because they're at a riot. And it led to a bad decision, which was to then shoot people. Even if he thinks that I was genuinely in self-defense, I was scared for my life, he shouldn't have been there in the first place. He shouldn't have had that gun in the first place. And I think that, especially when you get into the nitty gritty of what happened, his idea of I was scared and so therefore I shot people is also the same reason why he was charged by protesters, right? They thought that man with the gun was threatening us. I felt scared. My defense mechanism came in to then charge him and try and disarm him. Another protester who legally carried a firearm used it to try and stop Rittenhouse from continuing to shoot. He says the same thing. I pulled out my gun on him because I was self-defense and I was threatened. So it's really hard to get down to what exactly happened, but I think that even with the narratives around, it doesn't excuse the behavior.
I definitely agree with that, and I kind of where I stand on this in kind of a general encompassing is that I think Kyle Rittenhouse is almost like the high point or the acme of what our country has come to at this point. And to kind of put that into perspective, 3 years ago in Charlottesville, when Trump said there's good people on both sides, right? Like obviously that was just one part of what he was actually saying. But what I would go further and say, yes, there are good people on both sides, but actually where the state of our country is right now is that the muddled, confusing nature of where things are going have actually brought out the worst from both sides. And I think that's probably what's made this unfortunate is that people like Kyle are following a specific narrative, which is telling them that, police are being defunded. The cities are in wreck. They're in chaos. And all we have now is people like you to go out there. And that's an unfortunate narrative, I think, that is part of a bigger problem that is bipartisan at this point, is that there's a national narrative and then there's the personal individual narrative. And I think a lot of the individuals are just scared and nervous, and the pandemic has made us all hyper aware of all these problems. And then everyone's at home, everyone's stressed, everyone's aware. And then you just kind of get to this point where I think you're right that this kid had no intention whatsoever of killing anybody. And from what I've read, because I've been trying to sift through all the BS and just try to figure out who this kid was. And to me, he seemed like kind of your generic Midwestern, hunting community kid who was probably a good kid at the end of the day. Like, obviously I don't know him, but it sounds like also the fact that I understand the left's argument a little bit, which is kind of the fact that there's videos of this kid walking down the street with a gun after the shootings were happened. And he looks scared. People around him are screaming and running, and police just drive by. And if that was a black American in that same situation, they would have shot and killed him. Let's be completely honest. But I want to go back a little bit, like just take a few steps back to kind of how this all started. And it kind of started with, again, social media and these vigilante kind of militaristic militia groups. And so from what I'm seeing is that it started with the Kenosha Guard, which was, this kind of quasi Facebook kind of like, to me, it looks like kind of a parallel to something like the Michigan militia that kind of started on Facebook. And it was started by a guy named Kevin Mathewson, who, from what I'm seeing, was actually like a pretty normal dude who just wanted to defend his community, but also was unhappy with police violence. Because there's a quote from him where he said, "I agree with these protesters. I'm sickened by what happened. But the folks that come here, they want to burn down people's homes. They want to cause millions of dollars in property damage. Those are evil things to me," he said. And then so basically he started this group, which since has been deactivated on Facebook. And it kind of just brought together people from around the area who were unfortunately a mixture of alt-right, concerned citizens, law enforcement, security consultants. Like it was everybody. And that's why these movements are so complicated, is because, you know, you have a few alt-right trolls or a few maybe white supremacists thrown in with just concerned citizens who feel like their cities are getting harmed and it's hurting the little guys there. And so, you know, and so unfortunately he said that, you know, after this he had no connection and he was very concerned about what happened. But that's my issue with this, is that our country has gotten, I think, so down the rabbit hole that there are good and bad people on both sides. And unfortunately, I had a feeling this was going to happen eventually, something like this. And here we are.
Yeah. And again, I think it's, you know, he's wrapped up. I think he got wrapped up in that narrative of like, these people are trying to tear down your country. You know, they're not on this. They're not fellow Americans. They're a mob that's going to take away what you love. And that is very different from what I understand the protests to be, is a group of angry people that are upset and tired with police violence. You know, Jacob Blake, I believe his name was shot 7 times in the back. You know, why do we have this problem so much more than other countries in the United States? And so, like, yes, you know, rioting and looting and lighting businesses on fire is certainly not good. But I don't also equate that then to mobs are going to then take away everything I know and love about America. I don't see that. I see it as people that are upset that they haven't been listened to about police brutality, and they're showing their feelings about it in a way that is destructive. It might not benefit their local communities, right? And certainly arson and all that, you know, needs to be prosecuted. Of course, I believe that, but that does not then, you know, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, that does not then mean that these people deserve to be shot. There is a judicial process we have, right? It is not up to the next American over to then take a gun out into the public, in an idea of defending yourself. You know, like, it's not your job to go out into riots and start waving a gun around. And this is what happened, right? You know, these people were killed because this person, Kyle, chose to do that. He didn't, you know, again, in his mind, he probably thought he was doing the right thing. But none of that would have happened had he not decided to take a firearm to that town. I also want to address the problem of, like, you know, victim blaming or looking into backgrounds, right? I've heard a lot of people that are like that are saying, you know, well, look at the people he shot. They weren't exactly saints. You know, I think one was had a sex like a sex charge, I believe, something with a minor, and then the other person that was killed had a robbery charge. Again, that doesn't justify killing them. Our judicial system doesn't work like that. Because someone is a criminal or has committed a crime in the past, it does not then forego all of their human rights in the future. That's not how it works. I'm glad it's not how it works. And so when people are looking at him like, oh, well, he killed people that were already bad, extrajudicially, it was against the law. In the same token, I see a lot of people, talking about apparently there's a video of Kyle Rittenhouse hitting a girl in front of his high school or something, like last year, like a viral video because of that. That does not pertain to this case. You know what I mean? I'm sure the lawyers will bring it up as kind of a character, attack or whatever, but we have to look at what happened that night. Regardless of someone's past, they don't deserve to be gunned in the street. So I think I just see so much of like justifying what happened using this rhetoric and these alternate sources of like, well, the one guy was a pedophile, so he deserved to be shot, or well, they were all past out curfew, so they should have been past curfew. They want to get hurt. Same thing with Kyle Rittenhouse. He shouldn't have been out past curfew with a gun. Like all of these things apply. Like if you apply them equally, it kind of negates the argument. The self-defense argument can be applied to both sides. Both felt threatened for their life and decided to take action that they felt defended their life. You know.
Yeah, and sorry.
Well, I was just saying, like, the rhetoric I hear from either side is strange because it kind of cancels each other out. And so what it boils down to me is one citizen killed other citizens extrajudicially with a AR-15, and he's getting charged for that.
Yeah, Drew, do you know what this kind of tells me is that our civil society's on the brink. And I know I've said this too often the last 3 weeks, but I'm not trying to be alarmist here, but we've kind of thrown due process out the window.
Yeah.
And both sides are extremely guilty of that. And what it's telling me is that neither side has a trust in our institutions to handle a problem.
No.
And so, for example, the investigators who want to look into Kyle Rittenhouse, there have been several public officials who have said it's not worth looking into him because he's guilty, which is, getting rid of his due process as a person. But then at the same time, I've heard this a bunch of times about everyone from George Floyd to the recent murders in Wisconsin, where people say, well, George Floyd had fentanyl in his system and he had multiple convictions and, he'd done petty crime. And I'm like, that still doesn't mean he should have died. That still doesn't mean he shouldn't be given due process in the current situation of dealing with a counterfeit 20 or whatever that is. Right. And that's the problem, man, is that because we've gotten so divided, I would argue that most Americans all of a sudden, not most, but I would say the fringes of both sides don't believe in our institutions anymore. And that is extremely alarming to me, because when you get to that point, that's when vigilantism or extrajudicial killings come into play. Yeah. And I think that's where we're getting right now, is that, I mean, even Kamala Harris, I know, was quoted saying, well, this guy's guilty. And yeah, he, like you said, he killed people. So we need to look into it, and it's still murder. But we don't know the whole story. And, it's interesting, since then, now looking at some of the cases, it does look like this was a good kid who was wrapped up where, early on it was painting him as some alt-right, follower of a group. And it's just so complicated. But again, they're framing everything as this person is the other side, so it's okay to do it. And I want to use an example for a minute, and I've been kind of thinking about this all week, and it's Lexington and Concord, which arguably started the Revolutionary War. Right. And obviously it's an extreme example, but this was kind of where the British under General Thomas Gage hoped to prevent a rebellion inside of the colonies. So they went to seize weapons in Concord, Massachusetts, and they were awaited by colonists who opened fire back. And now the big question amongst historians is who fired first and who fired second, and who actually started this conflict. And arguably, I think we are slowly getting to a Lexington and Concord moment where we have armed, angry people on both sides. And it doesn't really matter who starts it, but it matters what happens next. And, I'm not trying to be alarmist, but I do think we're getting to a point where Milwaukee actually might be the closest this country's been in a long time recently. Kenosha is the closest I think this country has been in a long time to a Lexington and Concord moment where open firing and death happens and both sides are going to blame the other one.
Yeah, that's what's really disheartening, right? Is I see the aftermath of this just making things worse. Also, by the way, Sinbad Samoa, thank you for the follow on Twitch. Nice. I'm reading here in the NPR article we read before we recorded this that the first line it says their minds are made up about Kyle Rittenhouse, and that's very true. Within days, everyone knew what side they were on. Right? He's either he was just trying to defend his community and he was stand your ground, or you were this was a terrorist, a white terrorist. And I think that, like we said, it's so murky. When things are so murky and when things kind of have a lot of holes in the story, right? Because again, I don't know how the kerfuffle even started, right? There's something about a dumpster, but who attacked who first? We actually don't really know. The video that got viral was only halfway through the altercation when he started shooting, so we actually don't know what happened before. And it's these blank areas, these holes that people fill in their own narrative and fill in their own identity and fill in their own politics. And we have to be so careful not to do that, because it does lead to this, quick bifurcation of whose side are you on? Are you with us or against us? And I see it on the left and the right. It's getting scary that, again, that we're not viewing each other as fellow Americans, right? I don't think, especially if you look at how the police treated Kyle versus how they treated the protesters. And it's very clear that they're viewing one side as, hey, these are other patriotic Americans, and then the other side is, these are the bad guys. And that's not true. Everyone in Kenosha was an American, a fellow American, and people weren't treated like that. What really bothers me is Trump is visiting, I think, Kenosha currently. I think he's visiting Kenosha right now. And I do worry that he's just going to fan these flames of violence and not condemn, the vigilante justice we saw. In fact, I pulled up an article earlier where it said that just today, Donald Trump is not weighing in. The White House says Trump is not going to weigh in on Kyle Rittenhouse. Usually I would admire something like this. Like, wait for all the facts and, don't speak too soon. But for a guy that always speaks too soon and, says things like, well, I don't know the whole story, but I love QAnon and whatever, is very quick to make judgments. It's interesting that he doesn't make a judgment on Kyle Rittenhouse now. How quick he is to make judgments on, evil thugs running around L.A., but he says there's good people on both sides when the guy ran through protesters in Charlottesville, and he's not willing to weigh in yet on Kyle Rittenhouse. It's just, I see a pattern of him being very cautious to comment on right-wing violence and very quick to comment on left-wing violence. Whereas I think people should be, we should condemn both, which perhaps you could argue some Democratic leaders have not done strong enough, but Joe Biden has come out just the other day and saying that he unequivocally condemns rioting and looting and violence. And he even said, I challenge Donald Trump to do the same. Now, of course, Joe Biden's going to say that because he's got to win over the people in the middle that are scared of this violence. But still, I don't know. I just found it weird that Donald Trump is just so silent on something like this. Decided to visit Kenosha, but not meet with the families of Jacob Blake. What is he going to do there?
Yeah, I mean, it's Trump's silence, I think, is telling, because you're right. This is a guy who doesn't literally know how to shut the F up no matter what. But at the same time, I would actually argue myself that I almost think silence in Trump is sometimes better.
True.
Just because this is a guy who whatever he says inflames some part of his base.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to push back a little bit on both sides here, mainly because I think Democrats were given a trap back after the George Floyd death. The whole defund movement. It was at the time, it was kind of just a trending statement, defund the police. And Democrats kind of bit it and took the dog treat and have kind of gone with it. And so, unfortunately, I would argue that they have really actually helped this problem get worse, because you've now had famous leaders from around the United States on the Democratic side talk about support for defunding the police. And you're right, Joe Biden has always been for community policing. He has spoken out against the violence from both sides, the protests, the rioting, and then Kyle Rittenhouse. But there's a lot of prominent Democrats, especially more in the progressive wing, that have kind of taken this bait. And it's allowed kind of where we're at now, where we do have two visions of America. And, you and I actually together haven't really talked about, the conventions the last 2 weeks. But both sides really do have a very different view of how the United States is doing right now.
Yeah.
And I'm just worried that, I'm gonna put a link into our Discord real quick. It is a poll from The Hill. And it's kind of an alarming poll, I think, for Biden. Let me get that to you real quick. But it's kind of talking about how minorities inside of cities are actually, like, Trump's approval amongst minorities in cities is growing. And I think it's just because there is a feeling of lawlessness that almost the Democrats in some ways have been willing to accept. And I'm not saying all of them. And you're right, Joe Biden. I mean, I still think Joe Biden would always be a better leader than Trump is for so many reasons. But at the same time, I don't know if a lot of inner city Americans feel safe. And so I don't know if you want to pull that up real quick. I just put it in Discord.
President Trump's support among black voters rose 9 percentage points amid the Republican National Convention. A new Hill-Harris X poll finds. Yeah, I have that up.
Yeah.
Well,
Perfect.
I mean, look, I mean,
But I
going up 9% when you're already down in below the 10% margin is
right.
good,
But
but
the rest of it says is that amongst black voters, I believe it says he has a 24% popularity, which is significantly growing from where it was, and he has a 32% amongst Hispanic voters. And see, the thing is, I think we forget that a lot of people in cities that are being impacted by this are minority voters.
sure.
And I think that's one thing that unfortunately Democrats along the way have maybe lost a little bit of sight of, is that yes, these protests I think have good meaning, and I support reform inside of the police department and inside of our system, but some of the outcomes of this are not beneficial, and
Oh,
we're
of
starting to
course.
see a change.
Of course.
So sorry.
No, it's certainly understandable that, people don't want rioting and looting in their towns. That's understandable. I understand why some people are upset and maybe a little bit worried. Um, especially, small business owners that had their businesses, ransacked and stuff. I mean, that's terrible. That's awful. Um, but I think it's being conflated. Like, I think this narrative is now, it's not like, hey, there's protests going on. Some of it's getting too far out of hand. But we still have to remember the narrative is. There are evil mobs that are going to destroy America that are running rampant. I don't think that's true. I really don't think that's true. I think that is true in flashpoints, like the CHOP thing, which the whole CHOP experiment was pretty dumb. We covered why that failed, that whole autonomous zone that ended up leading to crime and someone dying. I definitely think there's flashpoints where things get out of hand. But that has always been the case when there is massive social change going on and you're at a crux of history. If you look back at the civil rights movement, which, I hope everyone would look back at fondly, also had riots. When MLK was killed, there was riots. It doesn't mean that over time the benefits of that struggle and that movement are still good things, right? So I just think the narrative's getting conflated. Now, again, I do understand why people are worried, and of course I understand that people don't want arson and looting in their towns. I mean, who would? But this idea that it's only Democrats that are doing, like the idea that the Democrats are also in control of it all is also weird to me, right? Because, one, you have Joe Biden saying, I'm not for violence. But two, it's not like Nancy Pelosi has a lever on the violence meter of protests. You know what I mean? These are people that are aggravated that have felt this way under Republican and Democratic presidents. You know what I mean? There was still social justice movements going on under Obama. There was still police brutality under Obama. It's not like it's a Democrat thing aimed at taking down Trump. It's a certain movement about police brutality that is recurring in the United States, unfortunately. So I don't know. I mean, but you're right though. That I think that this issue, talking about the election, this issue is something where I can see Trump gaining back voters. Right? He hasn't handled COVID well. The economy is in a weird spot. But people that are scared about their communities, I can see Trump picking them back up using this narrative of these evil mobs are going to take everything you love.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, first, yeah, I like on the last thing you said, I think that this is going to get rural voters out to vote. Especially in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and I think a lot of that Midwest belt. But obviously, that was already given. But now the second thing is, yeah, you're definitely right. In the civil rights era, 1960s into the 1970s, there were a bunch of riots and there was a lot of unrest. Now, this is more of an abstract kind of philosophical thing, kind of that I'm going to use as my framework for this response. But it's that I almost think that we're in a different place in terms of terminology and an abstract definition of where we're at. Because I think that our systems have changed. The civil rights movement in the 60s, like the Civil Rights Act and all the voting rights acts that passed, those actually were black and white, which they were enabling more people to vote and they were enabling more people to have rights. But I think since then, our systems, by definition, on paper, aren't inherently racist anymore. We've taken a lot of the yellow tape away from some of our racist institutions of the past. But the problem is that now we're dealing with the long-term, everlasting effects of systematic racism. And I think that's one of the problems that we've had a lot of problems dealing with on both sides, is that Republicans want to say, well, the Voting Rights Act And, everything Lyndon Johnson did just kind of erased, systematic racism, and it's all good. So why are these people burning down our cities? And the left is kind of saying, well, all of our systems are still, I'm not saying everyone. Like I said, I'm talking about more kind of the loudest voices, right? But a lot of those more progressives on the left are saying, that our whole country is racist. And there's people I talk to, like, quite frequently, that tell me that we almost need to kind of bring down the system to, break it down to bring it back up again. And the problem is I think we have an abstract ghost of racism that is still existent. And it's almost, how do you change that? Like, there's family issues, cultures of violence, poverty from generations of oppression. And that's where we're at. Is it's a gray area again. And Trump has been the worst president in history, in my opinion, in dealing with gray areas. And that's where we're at now. I mean, Nixon was able to, I think, win on Law and Order because it was still black and white, no pun intended. It was still, kind of the repercussions of all these giant civil rights changes that were constitution and legally done, right? So it's just, we're in this gray area, and gray areas are the best for violence and chaos. And I think that's what we're seeing. And we need a president who can at least say a couple of good things about both sides,
We certainly are in a lot of gray area. And I think back to what you said about explicit differences in law, how in the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, it was very, explicit discrimination that they then tried to combat. And now, I think a lot of people argue well, look at the laws. There's nothing that would discriminate, and the difference is, what's called, de jure and de facto, right? The de jure law says you're not supposed to discriminate by race, religion, creed, and all that. So then, but the de facto is it still happens. The de facto is, I have Latino friends that instead of putting, Jorge or Jose, they put John on their resume because it increases the chances of them getting an interview. It's not because that the interviewer is a Ku Klux Klan racist, but it's just a de facto bias that is in our society that they've recognized and are trying to combat. On the same end, right, with policing, right? Yeah, I highly doubt there's any de facto laws that say, treat a black person differently than you would a white person. Of course not. It's not written down, but it's enacted that way. It's a de facto reality for many Americans. And so, like you said, it's harder to prove that to people that don't believe it, right? Nikki Haley saying we don't live in a racist country. Because look on paper we don't. Sure, on paper, everyone's treated equally, but the reality is very different. Just like in the same way that on paper, communism works, but in de facto, it doesn't. So, but you're right, though, that it's because it is now kind of under the bed sheets, or for many people, they don't experience it or haven't in a while, right? It's harder to understand racism if you're not a victim of it. So I don't know. It is tough with this gray area, and you're right. Trump is certainly not the president for gray areas and nuance. That's for sure.
No. And I mean, I guess we should probably start wrapping it up here, but
yeah.
I just do worry that, that's the thing is you have a lot of, especially rural, middle class or poor voters who don't see still these systematic problems that coastal Democrats keep talking about. And I think it makes it easier to create a narrative, especially people like Tucker Carlson were talking about how this kid was a hero, on primetime on Fox News. And if you're kind of a disenfranchised white voter from, I don't know, Iowa or Kansas, and I'm not trying to degrade anybody, but, if you're someone who's probably never been impacted by racism and you're also struggling, you're going to find it hard to listen to people like AOC who are telling you that every system is still inherently racist. And So I think you're going to be more likely to support someone like a Kyle Rittenhouse who's going to take matters into his own hands, because to you, finally, there's someone standing. And like I said, I'm not defending it. I'm just trying to understand why I've seen even my own friends on Facebook post this stuff. Like, this is a hero. I mean, I think vigilantism in general is dangerous because it means that you have no trust in the state anymore and you're taking it into your own hands. But I get it. And so I'm just worried that the punches are now leading to gunshots, and it's scary.
I think the last thing I'll leave with is I think the police are in an interesting situation now because they are not trusted by the left, right? Because of police brutality. And now they're not trusted by the right because now the narrative is cops aren't doing anything to stop these mobs. So you have you have this idea of vigilantes saying, well, we'll take matters into our own hands because we don't trust the police to do it themselves. Then you have the left saying we don't have to trust the police to protect us. So I do think that, police departments really have to think about how they're going to reform and adapt to the modern world, because they need to build their trust back, not just among the left, but among the right. They need to build their trust back with the public, the American public. And I think they need to make some changes to do that. But, that's a whole nother episode that we've touched on before.
Yeah. And yeah, exactly. If we were a healthy society, I don't think we'd have this problem. So we're going to need to look inward and figure it out. So I think that does it for this episode. If you're listening here on Twitch, obviously we're going to continue into the next one. But if not, please check us out later in the week. We're going to have some more content coming your way. What do you think? Is Kyle Rittenhouse a terrorist? Is he a murderer? Or is he a hero who's finally stepping in? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I think my opinion's made, but please let us know. And you can find us on Twitch, YouTube, Podbean, Apple Podcasts, iTunes. And yeah, please keep talking to your neighbors.
Yeah,
Take care.
Be nice to your neighbors.